Thank you, everybody, for coming in a very special day, not only because it's Friday the 13th, but because it's graduation, it's last day of final exams, and of course, it's a very important day for us because we are hosting a colleague of ours who is going to be bringing her research on specific topics that deal with digital technologies. So let me introduce Amy Gonzalez, who is assistant professor in the Department of Communication at the University of California, Santa Barbara. And of course, for some of you who haven't been in Santa Barbara area, it's demoralizing a little bit in terms of what you enter the campus and then you see the buildings, which are, of course, all of the traditional buildings for scholarly work. Then all of a sudden, you turn and then you see the Pacific Ocean. And then part of the classrooms are literally on the beach. It's amazing. So you are suffering, Amy. You are suffering in that place. Her work examines the effects of social interaction via communication technologies on individual identity, social support, and well-being, and the consequences of disrupted access to communication technology. She's especially interested in this phenomenon for people from disadvantaged communities. Her work aims to advance theoretical help mitigating the long-term consequences of new digital infrastructures that might otherwise exacerbate social inequalities. She has published in major journals in our field, and the title of her talk is The Importance of Access to Digital Technology for Building and Maintaining Social Capital and Quality of Life. Please join me in welcoming Amy Gonzalez.
Thank you all for being here for all of the reasons that Manny just described. I'm impressed that there are this many of you here. So thank you. I really appreciate that. And thank you for inviting me. I'm really excited to have this opportunity. I've actually never been to MSU, and it's a beautiful campus. And I actually love the cold. So it was nice to get, I know this sounds insane, but and maybe just mean, but I left 70 degrees and I was pleasantly surprised to have to wear a coat, actually. So thank you. As Manny said, I'm going to be talking about work looking at building and maintaining social capital and quality of life. Most of my work tends to look at that these days, but it tends to kind of fall into two different camps. And so I thought to give you a sense of who I am, some of you may know me, many of you probably don't, I'm actually going to show you a Wordle that I created. So I recently submitted my dissertation, feels like it, my tenure packet. And so out of curiosity, what I did was I took all of so when you submit a tenure packet, you have to submit sample articles. And so I scraped all of the text from all of those 5 articles and threw it into a Wordle because I was curious what would pop up. And so, some of these things are predictable: internet, groups, journal, some numbers because I didn't take out the page numbers. But I thought this was kind of an interesting exercise in seeing who I am. And in fact, many of these themes kind of cut across these 2 areas of my work. So what I'm going to be talking about today will certainly have to do with access and also the phone. I do end up doing more work than I realize, I think, on mobile technology, and then a lot of work on health, especially perceived health and socioeconomic status. So the way I tend to my elevator pitch is that I'm interested in kind of 2 key questions. What are the physical and psychological health benefits of using social media, communicating over digital technology broadly, especially for marginalized groups? And I tend to focus on kind of the benefits. So how can we strategically leverage these devices, these platforms for connection, or when doesn't that work quite so well? And then given all of that, what are the consequences when access to those devices, to those platforms is disrupted? And so what I thought I would do, maybe more simply put, in other words, you could maybe say, I'll be talking about support too. Sorry, pull up this last circle. So put more simply, how do people connect with digital technology, and what if they can't? Right? These are kind of the pared down versions of these two areas of my work. So I'm going to do what every speaker does, which is try to present too much work in one talk. But hopefully I've tried to streamline it so that it'll make sense. And I think it builds a nice story to first talk about and motivate kind of the benefits of tech. Is that my phone? Okay, sorry. I just want to make sure that wasn't me. The benefits of connection, and then thus what are some of the consequences of not having access. So we'll start with this first question, and I'm actually going to present some data that's a little bit dated, but again, I think it makes for a nice pairing, and it comes from a body of theory that I'm very interested in kind of continuing to delve into. So are any of you familiar with the social diversification? Can you raise your hand if you've heard of this research? Okay. So the two hands that I expected, but not much else. And it's a very, part of what I love about this work, and the basic premise is that the idea that the internet acts as a vehicle for overcoming existing social inequalities in access to information and social networks. So what I like about this work is that it flips kind of traditional digital divide stories on their heads, right? And points to the ways that individuals from marginalized groups can again strategically benefit from access to technology, and kind of maybe speaks to some of the ways that they tend to use it more and more broadly. So I'm sorry, I speak very fast. I'm going to try and slow myself down. This work actually came out of scholarship originally done in Israel, and by Gibraltar Mesh. Gibraltar, is his first name? Gustavo, thank you. I knew I was going to mess that up. He found that Arab Israelis are more likely to broaden their networks online than Jewish Israelis, who are more likely to reinforce their existing capital, and also find something similar with searches for health information. And some subsequent work has complicated it a bit, but there's not a ton in this area. And a kind of a key driver of this work is the reality that in Israel in particular, there's extreme geographic segregation, racial and ethnic segregation, such that the presumption is that you can't walk outside your door if you're Arab Israeli and have access to the same capital. And so at the time that I came across this, I had data collected in Philadelphia, which is also extremely segregated, racially segregated. And so I thought that would be an interesting context in which to look at this question, which at the point that I collected the data or had the data, had only been looked at in Israel. So I thought before I show you racial segregation in Philadelphia, I would first give you a taste of racial distribution, racial and ethnic groups here locally. So up in the corner, this is East Lansing. So these data come from the Census Bureau's American Community Survey, and it's based on, the small text up here says samples from 205 to 209. So it's a bit dated now. It was less dated at the time that I was collecting the data. But you can still see, right, so blue dots are 500 Black African American, green dots white, yellow dots Hispanic, so you can see that little pocket down in there. Red dots are Asian, which you can see one kind of pocket here and kind of sprinkled throughout. And then gray is other. I'm really curious. I don't know what is this? What is this? Is this a street? Is this a freeway? It's a freeway. That was incredibly pronounced and very shocking. So this is where I was in Philadelphia. This is the campus over here, relatively diverse. I was living over here. And this becomes even more striking when you pair next to it the same census tract data on economic distribution. So the lightest green census tracts are those making under $25,000 a year. The darkest green is $100,000 or more. And so I'll just give you a second to kind of absorb how perfectly mapped on, right, race and income distribution is, which is true, unfortunately, many, many places. And Philadelphia becomes a really striking example because of the extreme racial segregation. And so what I was interested in is, would we see this kind of same phenomenon where, given this geographic segregation, are African Americans and Latinos, and also people with less education, so I looked at educational differences, likely to be using the internet to try to circumvent some of this racial segregation and try to broaden their networks to access greater capital, right? So this is the hypothesis of that study. African Americans and Latinos and people with no college experience would be more likely to have more diverse exchanges online rather than offline, which is kind of a key piece of this study. Whereas whites, Asians, and those with some college experience are more likely to have more diverse exchanges, or at least equally diverse exchanges offline rather than online. And I will talk in a bit why I put Asians in that group. Asians socioeconomically in the US are very diverse themselves with, so I can speak more to that specific choice in a bit. But let me just say, so the contribution to social diversification research was kind of 3 key points. One is it hadn't been tested in the US. That was kind of nice to see if you'll see these same patterns. Another was, because what I collected were diary data, I was actually able to test this kind of untested hypothesis that you would actually see a difference between online and offline communication. I mean, it makes sense, right, that difference would be pronounced. But one could argue that maybe you're just going to see this broadening of communication patterns by these marginalized groups, regardless of who they're talking to, regardless of the platform that they're talking on or the channel that they're using, right? And so the way I was able to do that was to purchase the last 45 Palm Pilots on Amazon, which I don't think is a joke, actually. The guy that I used a software that had been designed specifically for Palm Pilots. So this was collected in 2010. It was in press for quite a while, so it was only published recently. But he closed up shop after. He was like, this is the last $2,000 I'm ever going to get. So the software that was used was like, designed for survey collection on these devices. But it was the reason I wanted to use them, right, is because I didn't want to. I mean, at this point, 2010, you couldn't necessarily presume that everyone's got a smartphone anyway. But even if they did, I didn't want to give them a device that would, that would bring them to the very technology that I was interested in measuring, which is like increasing or changing their online, behaviors or patterns of use. But at the same time, I wanted to take advantage of having kind of automated random alarms prompt the participants, and then being able to record that rather than having to use paper and pencil. So I'll give you a kind of a visual of what the data look like. So Keith, you remember me talking about this study. They come into the lab, and at baseline got a variety of measures, but for the purposes of this study, measures also of social support and individual differences. And then over 6 days, at the end of the day, I had them take a brief survey, but throughout the day, I had pre-programmed the Palm Pilots so I'd ask them their waking hours for each participant, and then pre-programmed 6 to 10 random alarms for every person in advance of the survey. And so when an alarm would go off, there was a series of about 20 questions, and I can show people the data if they're interested in this is probably too dated, but lots of data that has been untapped in this survey, because I asked a variety of questions, but they were all supposed to be in response to their 2 most recent social interactions, whatever those were. And then they came in on the 7th day and filled out some self-report data. So for this particular study, I've published other papers off of this, but I'm going to be looking at the repeated measures daily, and then also using data from the baseline. So I ended up with only 76 people in the sample, and that's in part because I used the Palm Pilots, and I'm glad I did. I was really able to see when people had just jumped on and they knew they had to fill out a minimum number of surveys, and so you could see people who just jumped on and filled them out quite randomly, right? They weren't actually attending to the surveys as they were supposed to. So after being able to drop bad data, end up with about 2,600 social interactions that I'm measuring. Only 15% of them were online, which speaks to, I think, in some ways, just how much, granted it was a while ago, but speaks to how much we still interact with people face-to-face when you're randomly sampling our communication. And I just flyered throughout Philadelphia, all parts of Philadelphia, to collect the sample. And then they came into the campus, and we walked them through the study. So the primary independent variables in this study then are race, ethnicity. And again, so the reason that I ended up putting Asians in this category was kind of twofold for me. I mean, there's a few other reasons, but when you look at kind of personal wealth or household wealth in the U.S. In recent data, on average, I think whites, at least around the time that I collected this, was like 113,000. Asians was like 78,000 on average. African Americans and Latinos is like under 8,000 per household. Like a really shocking difference, right? Also, though, there was this interesting ASR study finding that Asians that are educated, college educated in the US, that's a really key predictor of whether or not Asians are going to have wealth that approximates those of whites. And all of the Asians in my sample did. They had all been educated. They were all university educated in the US. So also looked at some or no college. And then the way that I measured kind of the two primary dependent variables, the first was whether or not this was a weak tie in person that they were interacting with in any given social interaction. And so when they'd come into the lab initially, part of kind of a very traditional social support measure is to actually ask people to write the initials down of the number of people that they feel they can speak to about a personal issue, I think is the wording of the question, or something, if you had to make a hard decision. And so what I actually had people do was write those initials down for us, but also put them on an index card. And then when they carried this Palm Pilot home with them, along with a packet of instructions, they had that index card with them. And so then what I did was, when the survey came up and they were prompted to respond, one of the questions was the person you just interacted with on your index card? So that way I could get kind of a consistent measure. If I said something like, is this person in your primary network? You can imagine that might vary from day to day. So they kind of referred back to that kind of initial reference of core network people. So we just measured whether or not it was a strong tie was on that index card and a weak tie was not. And then I had asked them their own racial ethnic identity, self-reported, and then they were asked to report on that of the person they were interacting with. And so I simply calculated whether or not it was interracial, and that also means that so if an African American was speaking to a Latino, that would still be interracial. It's not just because they were in that same disadvantaged group. So what did I find? So the data then, these are multi-level logistic data where the outcomes were, again, first, what was the probability that they'd had some sort of kind of weak tie interaction, that they were talking to someone outside of their primary support network, right? So again, social diversification would predict that that's going to be especially true for those in the disadvantaged group, which I'll show you. Online, because you're taking advantage of the web in that way, right? And in fact, these percentages the likelihood are quite high, especially for education, those with less education. But then it's even more striking when you compare that to the likelihood of having a weak tie interaction offline, which was pretty strikingly low. And then when you compare that to those in the advantaged conditions, you can see they're kind of right in the middle and more or less the same, right? Who they're talking to online and offline doesn't really vary that much with respect to how, in this sample, with respect to whether or not this is kind of a bridging tie, a new relationship, right, or a bonding tie. The race effect was only found for race. So African Americans and Latinos, slightly more likely to be having a perceived interracial interaction online than off, and you kind of see a little bit of the opposite effect, in fact, for whites and Asians. So again, I'm kind of moving quickly through to kind of set up. In some ways, I think one of the reasons this study and this body of work matters to me is because certainly from a theoretical perspective, it was nice to validate this hypothesis here in the US with this real-time data, but it also really underscores the need for digital access, right? If a whole other body of my work is about making sure we have access, work like this really underscores why that's so important. If you can point to the ways that marginalized groups in particular are leveraging these technologies. Now, most of this work has been done using big survey data. So what I'm actually doing right now is analyzing qualitative data to try to get at kind of the mechanisms of this a bit more and whether or not people actually perceive that this capital is able to actually manifest in any meaningful way. And so this kind of integrates a bunch of the social capital work that Nicole Ellison has done, and a bunch of it has been qualitative, but none of it has really looked at socioeconomic differences, certainly not really racial differences. So I'm kind of trying to wed that work with the social diversification work as I have started to code interviews, about 10 interviews with highly educated or non-university educated African Americans and Latinos primarily versus whites. So these are data collected in Bloomington, which makes it a little tricky because they're not dealing with the same geographic segregation, but just because there's not a big enough minority population to really to have segregation in that same way. But I'm just kind of starting to dig in there. So I'm happy to talk with that about that with people if they're interested. But I want to move on to this kind of second question. But again, this is kind of a taste of this part of my work that tends to look at how people are benefiting largely from these online interactions. So the second half of my work is very digital divide focused. What if they can't, right? And I'll start there by actually presenting CDC data. So I'll let you just kind of absorb that for a second while I take a drink. So interestingly, the CDC is one of the only places that I can find, I think this is quite telling, that regularly collects data on, and maybe someone in the room can tell me otherwise, that regularly collects data on mobile-only households. So loss of landline access, right? So in other words, most of us at this point, or about half of us, do not have a landline at our home anymore. And perhaps not surprising, this is even more true if you're living below the poverty line. So 70% of people below the poverty line don't have a landline phone, because why would you pay for both if your money's tight, right? And so one of the reasons that's really interesting to me is, as I've started to do work very much stemming from this initial body of work, trying to understand kind of the benefits of technology, I kind of stumbled into, as qualitative work so nicely provides often, this realization that there's big segments of the population that are regularly going without cell phones, that what I thought was kind of the great equalizer of technologies and why I was actually starting to work in that space is not as consistent as we'd like to think. And this is especially a problem if there's no backup, because what that means is actually there's entire segments of the population that are actually phoneless now that probably weren't before in this kind of weird, inconsistent way. And there's really no one's capturing that. Even the CDC data isn't capturing that kind of intermittent disconnection. And policy changes kind of how bad that looks, and I'll talk a bit about that. So it's a speeding bullet, as media research often is. But I think it's still an important issue that we should be talking about. So the way I stumbled upon it was because I was collecting, I was doing a field experiment in Manhattan in public housing. And I was looking to whether or not I could actually take some of Keith's work on community building in urban spaces. In particular, I was living there at the time, so that was convenient, and try to apply that to kind of small screen platforms, right? Because everyone has a cell phone, is my rationale, and not everyone has a laptop or a desktop. And so we put people on. This was certainly right before everyone had a smartphone, and I use everyone in heavy quotes, but also even those of us that did. Like iPhones, for example, weren't naturally aggregating group texts. So a group text was still kind of, wasn't easy for anyone to access. And so I was using GroupMe and putting people on these group texts and had control conditions where I brought people into the lab and told them they were in community groups with a handful of people in their neighborhood, but never gave them any platform to do that, just said, when you interact with them, you should reach out, say hi, and then in another condition, actually put people in these group texts and then let them talk for, I think it was 3 months. And so had data from the actual texts, which was nice. But before I actually did that study, and that's actually not the study I'm going to present, but I'm happy to talk about it if someone's interested, I went in with some grad students from Columbia and did qualitative interviews just to make sure that people were interested in, were thinking of their phones as devices for community building. Like, did that even seem feasible? Did you want to talk to your neighbor on your phone? Did you talk with people? Did you use your phone for safety purposes, health purposes, things that would maybe lend themselves then to this intervention? And so, I'll show you a couple quotes from that became a separate publication. And so, not surprising, phones were important. Had things, and this is admittedly one of the most dramatic, and I kind of cringe to put it up because it dramatizes kind of the experience of a public housing, but this was an actual quote. One woman said, I seen somebody get shot in the head. I saved his life because I called the ambulance, I seen where he ran. He tried to go upstairs to his building, but he collapsed in front of his building, and that's when I called the ambulance. And there actually is some interesting data I've seen out of the UK that finds that mobile phones are associated with increased or reduced mortality at emergency calls because you can get the ambulance there quicker, right? So that makes sense. So this is, again, there were other people, a lot of people with anxiety, people who were prone to seizures. Lots of people talked about kind of the essential nature of having their phones. How am I doing? You started 11. I'm going to skip the next quote just for the sake of time. So what I found was then there was also, when I said things like, do you talk to your neighbors? This was kind of a key quote for me. Yeah, so this is what I had asked her. Just do you use your phone to connect with people and your neighbors? And she said, yeah, and I miss it when I don't have minutes and I can't afford to buy them. Today I put $10 on one of them and the other one turns on the 13th. I feel naked, like, wow, gee, I need to talk to somebody. And there's nobody, and when I don't have my phone on, I talk to my cat, Rambo. I changed the cat's name. So this was kind of my entry into this realization that digital access, that even mobile access wasn't always consistent. And so I kind of went after this in head on, which had not been the initial purpose of this study. And so asked people then in a couple follow-up studies about repeated disconnection, using their cell phone, how often were they running out of minutes, when it would break, what do you do? And also asked about kind of laptop and kind of big screen disconnection, but initially started with a real focus on mobile disconnection. And so, of course, as again, qualitative data does, went in thinking that maybe there were going to be real health ramifications, and there kind of were, but in fact, what people seemed even more concerned about were things like social support. So this was an individual in Indiana. When my dad passed, the relatives, they were mostly in another state. I couldn't call them, and I couldn't talk to them, and I really didn't know. I wasn't happy. I was grieving, and they were, and I felt really disconnected. And it's not uncommon that I had people say, because if you're poor, your network is poor, right? And so by the time somebody's phone's back on, their daughter's phone's off. I had somebody who had been out of contact with his daughter for months because both of their phones kept being turned on and off. And actually, employment was a much bigger concern for people. So people would say things like, yeah, I don't have minutes all the time, and so employers can't call me as much. If they can't get a hold of me, they're going to call somebody else to do the job, and this is where I feel lost, right? Most of us have the luxury of not needing to be in contact with our bosses on a daily basis. But if you're working shift work, you're working part-time, which a lot of these people were doing, if their phones weren't on, those were dollars in their pockets lost. So I've actually since done a study just looking at that, and I'm happy to talk about that more later. So this construct that I've come up with, I've called technology maintenance, which is this realization that for all of us, there's continuous work that is required to stay connected, right? My phone's in my purse, but I usually hold it up. And these things break. They're fragile. They break for all of us, right? But many of us have, backup resources, and so we can deal with that and get a new phone or new device relatively quickly. But for low-income users in particular, right, they're more likely to rely on technology that's broken, borrowed, or what I call dependably unstable, so cycling through these periods of disruption. Especially this is true if you're using prepay phones, which is a great access for those who didn't, who previously would have had to have the credit to get a contract. But it also means what I see regularly, and I'm going to present field work from a study with people who were, I would say, phone insecure, is that you put on your minutes at the beginning of the month, and then if you run out of minutes or you run out of data, or your month is up and you don't have the 40 or 50 bucks to put on, to get that card, you're just going a few days without any sort of phone service. And again, it's the same population that actually needs to be not just in regular contact with their employers, but also caseworkers, social service providers. Like I had someone say they missed their food stamp re-up because their phone was off. So I've done some survey. Oops, that slide is not in there. Oh, it's making me go through all those again. So I've done a couple of different non-representative surveys and found that actually, and in this case I think it was larger screen disruption, but the quality of one's access was for students associated with worse grades, and in an HIV sample associated with greater stress and overall worse quality of life. So this quality of access, this stability of access is something that's really interesting to me. And so I'd done a bunch of qualitative work, done a few non-representative surveys, What I'd like to do is get representative data on this, but I thought one way to really kind of convince funders that that's worthwhile is to show this experimentally, right? To show some field experiment data demonstrating kind of a causal effect. And so I've done that and written this up with a massive team of grad students. And so the two primary hypotheses were that participants receiving stable monthly cell phone service would show improvement in self-reported health and well-being over time compared to participants in control. And then our second hypothesis that we'll present is that participants with less social support should actually benefit the most from having that stable monthly access. Now, I'll show my cards right here and tell you that we were actually hoping that social support would mediate this effect, and it has, as you can probably tell by this hypothesis, moderated it instead. And so we're still kind of playing with the data. This is fresh data. I'm still trying to figure out exactly what the mechanisms are, and so I'm hoping to get your thoughts about that. So the methods were that we randomly assigned 25 people to, if they needed a phone, we bought them a cheap phone, like a $40, $50 phone, and then paid their cell phone service for 6 months. And then in the control condition, actually gave people the financial equivalent in the form of a grocery card. So they either got like a Walmart card or a Kroger card. So that we could demonstrate, right, this is not just a function of us essentially paying one of their bills, but it's specifically giving them phone access that matters, right? So who is this population? So very low income residents near Bloomington. And so because this was a longitudinal sample, we actually contacted and had caseworkers help us target individuals who weren't dealing with like addiction problems or mental illness to the point that they would probably be hard to track. So we kind of, I can talk about the recruitment if someone's interested in how we did that, but kind of worked with a few different local nonprofits that primarily serve the poor. And so collected a month's worth of baseline data and then 6 months of manipulation. And the data I'll present here are this short form overall health survey, so a really well-validated overall self-report measure that's associated with physical and mental health, and then kind of 4 quality of life dimensions. And then this moderator was perceived social support, which comes from a couple of different Berkman items. So I also collected with most of the participants, or the team and I collected follow-up interviews. And so we're kind of digging in there for some of these mechanisms. So this is what the sample looks like. As you can see, it is very low income. So the median income is $11,000 a year. 42 years old, primarily white. Perhaps not surprising, primarily, very few with college degrees. And kind of key to this study, right, only one person in the sample had a landline phone. So again, when their phone's getting disrupted, or in the past when they don't have phone service, it's not like they had backups, right? And all of these people had at some point struggled with paying their phone bill. So that was kind of a key criterion when we talked to the caseworkers to get the sample. So I'm actually going to show you the data I'm going to show you a figure. And the figure actually shows the moderation. So it's going to show the effects by condition for people that have the least social support, moderate amount of social support, and the highest amount of social support. So you're just going to have to kind of visualize, if you collapse those, that would give you that kind of initial test of hypothesis 1, right? Which is just over time, what's the change? So months on the bottom, and these are, sorry, mind blanking, forget the point I'm trying to make. Mean-centered, thank you. And so for health, this is actually one of the most dramatic findings here with the overall self-reported health. So you can see this change over time. And again, so the red are the people that have the least amount of social support. And so you can see they have the most dramatic uptick in kind of increased overall perceived health over time. And actually, we went back and looked, when you split the sample and run the interactions just by condition, you actually don't see a difference in the control condition. I don't think, if I recall. I'm actually not running the data on these. So I'm working, one of the grad students has primarily been doing it. So But the interaction there is significant. And then here's for the 4 dimensions of overall quality of life. This here is not, this difference is not statistically significant, but all of the rest are. So again, over time, what you see is in the treatment condition, those with the phone, it had an increased perception of environmental quality of life, physical quality of life, and I have the measures if people are curious about those, kind of social quality of life, and that's more dramatic for the if you had less support, it was even more important to have that phone. So, in general, these findings are consistent with this poor get richer effect that Nicole Ellison and colleagues talk about in kind of that initial seminal Facebook use for social capital building study, right? That in that case, right, they found that those with lower self-esteem benefited more from being online. I think this tells kind of a similar story. Practically, essentially, it's demonstrating this import of cell phone access, especially if you have minimal support. From a policy perspective, like I said earlier, this is the policy on subsidized cell phone access. It is changing rapidly such that when I first collected the technology, that first interview study that I described, at that point, government phones were available in, I think, 5 states, and it was like 250 free minutes. Now, everyone's got them in every state, and it's moved up to about 1,000 minutes. So the nice part about this is I think it really does reduce the fact that you're running out of minutes. So that was a huge problem, is that if you were relying on a government cell phone for your primary cell phone access, you're running out of minutes on a pretty regular basis. It has just this year, 2019, went from 500 minutes a month to 1,000. So I think that's good. The bad side is that same program is currently, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but currently the same program that they're using to potentially start rolling out subsidized access to the internet. And as of right now, you're going to have to choose, right? Do you want to access a phone, or do you want to access the internet? And I think that is and I think in many cases, people might be accessing the internet, which is going to increase this problem. But we'll see. I don't know exactly how that'll unfold. Kind of big takeaways, and then I'll wrap up, are that essentially, ICTs are essential, and I would say that even though these specifics of technology maintenance disruption, I think are going to evolve, as I kind of just pointed to with these policy changes, I think the essential problem persists in that you're going to see variance in the quality of access, and part of my conversation with the scholars has been to just point out the importance of understanding how kind of differences in that quality is really going to be meaningful in people's ability to really exploit these devices. And so another kind of question for me is, going back to that first study, is kind of this intersection of social diversification and technology maintenance. I think it might help explain, on the one hand, you want these, it might explain recent inconsistencies, I think, in some of Mesh's work, where he's not necessarily finding that minorities are strategically leveraging these devices in the ways that the diversification hypothesis would have predicted. But on the other hand, they've got lower rates of literacy and lower rates of access, right? So how do you grapple with both of those, both theoretically and practically? And then, for me personally, one way I've kind of started to think about this next phase of maintenance work has been actually to try to investigate repair and refurbishing as a solution. So I've actually got funding on campus and in Santa Barbara to do some kind of pop-up repair shops to understand, if disconnection is the problem, can we think of ways to start subsidizing repair more broadly as a way to keep people connected? Or does that just reinstitute inequalities, right? I don't know. I think that's an interesting question. So I'm kind of also talking to low-income nonprofit organizations that do refurbishing and repair to understand that. So thank you.
Now we can open to questions.
This is what a fascinating body of work. Thank you for giving this talk and visiting us. I had a question about the visualization you were showing in that last study. It looks as though your treatment group was starting out lower on basically all of these measures. Is that true, or is that somehow a fact of the visualization?
No, they are. And we have tried to, and we need to go back and play with that. In fact, literally, I was texting or emailing the student that's running the data and saying, like, what if we just tested, because we're going to have to do some sensitivity analysis to play with that. Yes. We are controlling for various demographics, right, because of that. But it'll be interesting. Yes. The short answer is yes.
However you could get the sample is a great way to get the sample, but I was curious about whether it was random assignment individually or because
No, yeah. So we got the number. So what I did was actually left a sheet of information with people that I knew at each of the clinics and said something like, we're doing a study on access to resources, and if you're interested, give us your information, fill out this sheet. And so then what they would do is target people that they thought would be kind of viable for the length of the study and give that to them, and then I would just literally flip a coin before I picked up the phone to call them. So, and it's worked. Now, having said that, I do remember that at the very end, it's a pretty small sample, and it was strangely, even though I think the phone people, both in our one-on-one interactions with them, and I can tell you a little bit of what I'm finding in the qualitative data. I mean, they were there. They needed it. They wanted it. But I felt like we lost a few more of them, and so we went back in for like 2 or maybe 3 at the end, and just went. So the random assignment on like 2 or 3 of them is off. I don't imagine that it totally sways this, but on the other hand, it's possible. So we need to go back and play with that and like double check. Yeah. Yeah. I know. I don't know how much of a problem that's.
I mean, I think the findings are still look robust. I was curious.
Yeah, I mean, right, so this is the question. It's like, so it's because it's a change over time, I don't think it totally is fatal. So the question is there something about an initially more disadvantaged sample that's going to make them change over time in the way they relate to this? And I don't think so, but it's certainly something we're going to have to grapple with. Yeah.
So Amy, I do wonder about the age differences, and
that's interesting.
if that might, I don't know if you're controlling for that.
We are. I didn't put it up there, I'm sorry, but we controlled for kind of all of those demographics. But what were you thinking?
Well, just in terms of, a lot of different things I'm thinking. But thinking about older adults, where, a lot of my research is with, for them, depending on what type of education you did about actually using the phone, could be a challenge or not, or if they pick it up pretty quickly, they could see a steeper increase. So I would be curious if you had more age-delimited samples to look at some of this, and probably with this data, given the sample size, you can't really, but it might be something to think about for the future.
Yeah, and I'd be interested we could play with that and see. I don't think there was a huge amount of variation around age, so I don't, but that doesn't mean that it doesn't matter, but I don't think it mattered.
Like tech skills?
Well, that's what as you're saying that, I'm realizing, I don't know if we had any literacy measures, which is kind of embarrassing. I mean, what we did was at the baseline measure get like, what do you do online? So how broad is your use? What is your level of access? And I can't remember how much of that, I think there is some like a basic ownership or access measure in there that we're controlling for already. But I don't think we actually measured for literacy, which is pretty embarrassing actually. Yeah.
Wonderful stuff. Thank you, Amy. My question is something that Sheila and Dar and I have been talking about lately. I don't see him here. The difference between perceived support versus your network structure or size, how you measured it in terms of people's core networks. And so I'm wondering if some of this is a difference between, not actually in the amount of available support, either initially or at the end, but actually in changes in perception of support over time, and if that even accounts for the difference in where they started, right? So rather than, maybe it's that the mobile phone actually somehow, or so the intervention here is responsible for changes in perception that pre-existed the kind of control.
That's interesting. I hadn't thought about that. I mean, I certainly think that might be partly what's going on, although the reality is perceived support is a big predictor of health. I mean, perceived support matters. So even the degree to which it's just a change in perception, that's not so problematic for me. But I hadn't thought about it. I hadn't thought about changing its baseline differences.
Networks
Yeah.
and great connection. You're not socially isolated. You have similar core networks, but somehow your day-to-day interactions change in such a way that now you're more aware of who's available to you to give support, who's likely to give you support when you need it, and so on. So that is actually what's changing, which of course still matters for health, rather than the actual network change.
Yeah, I realized this, again, fighting with this on the way over here. I do have one measure that a colleague who studies emotion asked me to throw in kind of on a whim about anxiety and perceived anxiety and something related to that. And I was like wondering if that might actually be kind of a flipping that on its head and a way to get at that perhaps. Because when I read through the qualitative data, people talked about just that. I have a quote that I could pull up, but it'll take me probably too long to find it. But just about like, it was so nice to know that I just had this there, that this was just coming, that I had my phone covered. But I think it's maybe because of, related to this perceived support, right? Because if I know my phone's just there, then I know that my network is just there for me too, right? It's just, I don't have to worry about whether or not they're gonna be available. And I mean, because I just have limited amount of data, right, in every month that I can try to use to get at it, but yeah. Yeah, I have to play it out. In the baseline survey, I might have something, because we had more, there might be something that gets at that a little bit better. Yeah.
I do think this work is so important. I was just in DC. Sorry, I missed the breakfast this morning, got back late. At a National Academies workshop that I was chairing, sponsored by the National Institute on Aging. And the program officer sat there on the first day and said openly, everybody's got mobile devices. It's a critical way we're going to move forward with interventions. And it's like you tell them over and over, and they still don't get it, that the digital divide exists, that digital literacy is a big issue. And so I think we need to do more and more of this and get it in front of their faces.
Well, I think that's what's so scary, right? It's like everything is moving online, and there's presumption that specifically with health, that mobile health, remote health is going to change everything, and it's going to reduce all of these inequalities. And it's like, for me, I think the more and more I do this work, certainly I'm not saying we shouldn't move to digital solutions or interventions. I recognize the benefits of the reach, et cetera. I think we need to build in redundancies. Right? There has to be options that don't require you to have stable digital access when it comes to access to healthcare, access to applying for jobs, et cetera. And so how to convince people to do that when it's cheaper not to is a different question. But yeah, that's one of my biggest conversations with people is like, just don't presume this is the magic bullet. Yeah. Any questions about this or anything else? Yes, ma'am.
I was just going to say, I'm from Boston, and back at home, our doctor's office is all online scheduling notes, like all mobile apps and everything.
That's like the only way you can. It's like a perfect example, right? The very people who need, probably not a surprise to anyone in the room, right? But especially in countries where you don't have socialized healthcare, that poor people are much sicker. And so the very people who are most in need of healthcare are the least likely to have stable access to those technologies to now get access to their healthcare. And to me, the reason I think the technology maintenance concepts matters is less so now, but more for 50 years from now, right? When when that's going to be universally true. And I feel like if we're not having a conversation about this, what is currently just like a hidden disparity, because there's not representative data on this, then no one's going to care, because if you don't have data on it, you don't know it's a problem. So.
Do you want to go?
No, go ahead.
I study specifically children and media and families, and there's a lot of ways I was thinking about how this connects, but wondering if you have thoughts about how kind of generationally with young kids, and this is kind of getting back to what Sheila was talking about earlier, with kids who, even lowest income, still have a lot more familiarity with tech, right, than we've seen in the past. Certainly if they're making it through high school, they're using some technology, and how that, if at all, you imagine that kind of changing the trajectory of what we're seeing here.
Yeah, well, Sheila might kill me for saying this, but I feel like that's why I say that for me, I I think that to the degree that that's just going to change something, it's going to change literacy, but it's not going to necessarily change the fact that if you're poor, your device is still going to be crappier. You know, what that device is, maybe it's going to be, I don't know, a VR headset or something, but you're going to have the crappy VR headset that doesn't allow you to log in to talk to your doctor or whatever, right? And so, and in some ways it's like, well, duh, that's not surprising, right? What's the quote like from the, was it the FCC chairman like decades ago that was like, well, I want a Mercedes too, with respect to like wanting the internet? Does anyone remember the actual quote? I think of that a lot in my own work, this idea that somehow maybe, you know, certain people just expect that some people are going to have lower quality access. But I think when there's places where you can point to that shows that that disparity in access really limits what people can even do, I think that those places will continue to exist over time. It's just trying to find them and point to them and try to also point to a policy lever, right, at the same time, which is what I tried to do, right? So on the one hand, it's great that people have more minutes with these phones. That's really solving a really big problem that I've seen in my data over the last 5 years. But not if you start making people choose between the phone and internet access, right? So, but yeah, I mean, I do think that it'll certainly, yeah, well, we can talk more about that, a deal with some, it'll change that landscape.
Skills to do that.
So very, very interesting. I mean, quite fascinating. But I wanted to sort of push it a little bit on a couple of areas. And one was you know, how do you try to theorize all this? I mean, you say ICTs are essential for 21st century survival, right? But the same ICTs and the ways that we use them actually make it more difficult to survive. So there's really sort of there's different feedback loops, right? On the one hand, there's exclusion by the way we look at technology and by the way commercial technology is being used and it's used by institutions. At the same time, technology can integrate people and help overcome those divides. And I'm wondering whether, so by looking just at at one of those two parts, right? I mean, I think we're losing sort of an important larger dynamic that is going on. You have a nested system where technology can help, but there's also a bigger system that sort of makes
connecting
technology
people
the culprit,
globally.
right?
Is that kind of what you're referring to?
Yeah. So is there any?
I mean,
Any
so
way to
what I would
do
love
both?
to do, are you an economist? I've been just, shut up.
He actually
Well, then
is.
maybe we should talk. Because what I've really been wanting to do, I don't, maybe this study exists, but I don't know. I wasn't asking because you're showing your cards in the, no, that's not why. But because my answer requires an economist, but yes, now that you mention it, it does. But
Assume that, you know, it does be optimized or something.
yeah. Well, so what I've actually been wanting to do, if it doesn't exist, and again, I'm not sure it doesn't, because it is a bit out of my wheelhouse, right? Is I would love to do, if you could get the data on kind of such that you can compare across regions, whether that's globally or maybe even within the U.S. or even within a state. I don't know. And you look in variations, but in kind of traditional measures of physical access. By, you know, again, across regions, would be interesting to look, what I would predict you would see, right, is like both increased economic growth and increased economic disparity, right? I mean, I think, I know that that's like a different version of what you're getting at, but I think you can have both, right? I think you're talking about, I think a little bit what you're talking about is like the top versus the bottom of the socioeconomic ladder. Like across the board, if we're looking kind of like middle class and up, I mean, I don't think that these things are universally great for us necessarily, even when you know, I think there's other potentially downsides of being connected to this phone all the time. I gave a woman a ride last night in the car that I was in from, I was telling Keith this morning, from the airport, and, you know, we didn't talk at all. You know, we just stayed on our phones, and it was like a really cool opportunity. I kind of wanted to, but we didn't, and, So anyway, that's kind of a bit of a tangent. But I do think simultaneously, yes, I mean, that's the whole first half of my like training is all about kind of the psychological and health benefits of having access to these devices for building connection and support. And I don't think that disappears. The problem is when you don't have steady access to it, right? So it's just two different populations in part. Now maybe that's reflecting I'm not totally getting your question. I mean, does that speak to?
I think it's actually great because I mean I think what your research shows is that these interactions can manifest very differently depending on the context, right? And the other question I had for you is, I want to monopolize this. Why you were interested in these moderators actually Because I mean, I would have been surprised if they had been mediators. So why were you surprised?
Why was I surprised that it was a moderator and not a mediator? I wasn't surprised. I was just hoping that it would. I thought the support, I mean, it's naive because I should know at this point, the social support measures are so historically bad at, I mean, they just don't, it's hard to get at what we want in self-reported social support measures. And I often don't have success with them. What's actually more probably relevant and informative when it came to, the purpose of this study was to try to start to get at the mechanisms of this. I also had actually given every participant a communication log, I called it, and actually they were supposed to tally throughout the course of the month every time they talked to their doctor on their cell phone, every time they talked to an educator, and we were hoping that somewhere in that it would really kind of start to point to the mechanisms for this. So when that didn't work, we thought, well, maybe social support will capture that. So, I'm just kind of speaking very practically when it comes to kind of telling a story. I could see that why do you think social support wouldn't mediate it? Is that, you're implying that it shouldn't?
I think, so a lot of our empirical research on those phenomena, this goes way beyond this particular example, is I think we're sort of, too frequently we think about how these different factors interact in an additive way, right? But they most likely, a lot of theory, economic theory among other things, right, would actually suggest that they act as constellations. They kind of co-evolve, right? And so I would have actually, my hunch would have been this must be a moderation effect that you see here. And my hunch is again that this is way more pervasive than we are willing to admit. And our tools that we have and the way we collect data and we look at models, right, bias us in favor of thinking it's sort of we under-recognize it.
I actually completely agree with that. I actually have a very methodological beef with the way we treat mechanisms, and given the way that we collect the data, that we'd so often collect it all at one time, and then we pick this one and call it the mechanism and call this one the DV, and so but that's not a conversation I'm going to start with my reviewers. So when I submit the paper, so it's two different conversations.
And I think that the applications, just to put a little bit of a footnote, the applications for distress situations like domestic violence and the issues of economic distress, when you have that support network actually serve as the mechanisms in which they can help you.
Completely. Yeah, if you don't mind me ending, we actually had one participant, telling you just a quick anecdote, one participant who actually had experienced some domestic violence in our sample, who literally was in the hospital giving birth. My graduate student was one of the first people to see her baby because she was like, I need my cell phone. Because I just gave birth to my new baby and I want to be able to call all my family and tell them, and I'm out of minutes, so you need to give me I'm going to take my survey, and give me my, we collected the survey data later, but we brought her cell phone because she needed it. I know, right? She's all like leaning on the baby. No, I mean, yes, that speaks to just kind of absolutely how essential these are in moments of like high stress and yeah.
All right. Well, thank you, Amy, for a wonderful presentation.
Yeah, thank you all for your time, especially right now. I appreciate it.